The world stood still, and yet, it was on the edge of collapse. The year was 1939. Europe was still bleeding from the scars of the First World War. Nations were rebuilding, economies were fragile, and a restless silence loomed over every border. No one knew it then, but humanity was standing at the gates of its darkest hour. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was desperate for pride, for revenge, for power. Out of that desperation rose a man who promised glory, but delivered horror. Adolf Hitler, the self-proclaimed savior of Germany, had already transformed his nation into a war machine. His speeches echoed across the streets of Berlin, filled with anger, hope, and hate. While the rest of the world watched, uncertain and unwilling to intervene, Hitler made his move. On September 1 Street, 1939, the skies over Poland were torn apart by the roar of the Luftwaffe. German tanks, the feared panzers, rolled across the fields like iron beasts. Within days, polished defenses crumbled. It was the beginning of World War II. The world awoke too late. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but their words could not stop the tide that was already moving. Across Europe, the air grew colder, borders fell, cities burned. Millions of innocent lives were about to be swept away by a storm of steel, fire, and hate. In small villages, families clung to each other as air raid sirens screamed in the night. Children cried as the sound of distant bombs echoed like thunder. Everywhere, fear replaced peace. The age of reason had ended, the age of destruction had begun. But even as darkness spread, some believed it would pass quickly. It will be over by Christmas, they said. But they were wrong. The nightmare had only begun. This was not just a war of armies. It was a war of ideologies, a battle for the soul of mankind. On one side stood tyranny, racism, and total control. On the other stood freedom, democracy, and the hope of humanity. And soon, the whole world would be pulled into the fire. From the deserts of Africa to the frozen fields of Russia, from the skies of London to the jungles of the Pacific, the flames of war would consume all. This was not just a conflict, it was a test of courage, a test of endurance, a test of what humanity could survive when faced with its own darkness. As the storm gathered and soldiers marched, no one could imagine how deep the shadows would fall. This was the beginning of the darkest hour in history. Europe was burning. The invasion of Poland had been swift, brutal, and absolute. In less than a month, the map of Europe began to change once again. The world was watching as the German war machine revealed its true face, a force built for domination, powered by fear, precision, and speed. They called it Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a new form of warfare that combined the fury of air power with the speed of armored divisions. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The old tactics of trench warfare were gone. This was war in motion. German tanks, panzers rolled across the fields in tight formations. Above them, the Luftwaffe filled the skies with iron wings, and behind them, disciplined soldiers marched with deadly efficiency, crushing all resistance that stood in their path. The world realized that Hitler's army was not just strong, it was unstoppable. In the spring of 1940, Denmark and Norway fell. Then came the assault on the West Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, all overwhelmed in weeks. By the time the smoke cleared, German flags flew across Europe. But the true prize was still ahead. France. The French army was among the strongest in Europe, proud and confident. Yet even they could not withstand the storm. In May 1940, German troops bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line and poured through the Ardennes forests terrain the French believed was impassable. Within days, their defenses crumbled. Paris fell. The world gasped. France, once a beacon of art, culture, and power, was under Nazi control. The streets of Paris echoed with the sound of German boots. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The City of Light was now a city under occupation. In London, Winston Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister, stood before his nation and spoke words that would echo through history. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets." "We shall never surrender." But even Churchill knew the coming battle would test Britain's very soul. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched from a distance. Bound by neutrality, America had not yet entered the war. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the world could not remain divided forever. "If Britain falls," he warned, "then we all fall." As 1940 turned to 1941, the sound of marching boots grew louder. Hitler's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. Millions lived under his rule, many in fear, others in silence. The world had never seen power like this before, but even in triumph, the seeds of destruction were being sown. For every city conquered, every nation enslaved, there grew resistance, quiet, hidden, determined. Ordinary men and women risked everything to fight back against tyranny. The storm was far from over. It was only gaining strength, and soon, the skies over Britain would light up with fire. The sun had set on Europe. France had fallen. Nations once proud, now bowed beneath the iron heel of Hitler's Reich. Only one stood alone: Britain, small in size, but unbroken in spirit. Across the English Channel, the Nazi war machine prepared to strike again. Hitler's plan was simple: invade and crush Britain before it could rise in resistance. He called it Operation Sea Lion. But before his armies could land, the skies had to be conquered. Thus began one of the most heroic struggles in human history, the Battle of Britain. The summer of 1940 turned the skies over England into a battleground. The German Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers and fighters, their engines roaring like thunder. Cities trembled beneath the constant bombardment. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Bristol, night after night, bombs fell, and fires burned across the skyline. Yet, amidst the chaos, stood a small, determined force: the Royal Air Force. The RAF, outnumbered and exhausted. These young pilots, some barely 20 years old, took to the skies in their Spitfires and Hurricanes. Their mission: defend their homeland, no matter the cost. The odds were impossible. The Luftwaffe had more planes, more pilots, more experience. But the British had something the enemy did not: unbreakable resolve. Day after day, the RAF fought with courage that defied logic. They intercepted bombers mid-air, shot down fighters over open fields, and vanished into the clouds to strike again. They fought not for power or conquest, but for survival, for home, for freedom, for the world itself. On the ground, civilians endured the terror of the Blitz. Sirens wailed through the night as families rushed to underground shelters. In the darkness, they held hands, praying the bombs would miss their homes. Firefighters battled infernos as entire streets burned to ashes. But the British spirit refused to break. Through the smoke and ruin, Churchill's voice thundered across the radio. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few, the RAF pilots, became legends. They turned the tide of war. The German invasion plan was postponed, then abandoned entirely. For the first time, Hitler's war machine had been stopped. Britain had survived. But survival came at a heavy cost: tens of thousands dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, families torn apart. Still, hope burned brighter than ever. The free world had found its symbol, a small island nation that refused to kneel. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched closely. Roosevelt sent supplies and aid through the Lend-Lease Act, knowing the fight for Britain was a fight for freedom itself. As the smoke cleared from the skies, Europe remained enslaved. But a spark of resistance had been born. The world now knew that Hitler could be beaten, that darkness could be challenged. But even as Britain celebrated survival, the storm was far from over. The skies over Britain had cleared, but in the east, a new storm was forming, one greater than any before. It was June 22, 1941. The world awoke to the thunder of guns and the roar of engines as Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Hitler had turned his eyes toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across a front stretching more than 1,800 miles. It was a war of annihilation driven not just by conquest, but by ideology. Hitler saw the East as living space for his empire and the Slavic people as obstacles to be erased. The invasion was brutal from the first day. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed. Towns fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Soviet defenses shattered under the weight of blitzkrieg. German propaganda called it a crusade against communism. But on the ground, it was hell. Villages burned, civilians executed, prisoners starved. It was not just war, it was extermination. The Soviet soldiers fought fiercely, but the enemy seemed unstoppable. In the first months, millions were captured or killed. Yet, even in retreat, the Soviets refused to surrender. Joseph Stalin, the iron ruler of the USSR, declared, "Not one step back." The vast Russian land became both a battlefield and a weapon. As the Germans advanced, they faced the one enemy no army could conquer: the Russian winter. By October, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Hitler believed victory was near, but then the snow came: relentless, merciless, endless. The temperatures plunged below 30°C. Tanks froze, guns jammed, soldiers wrapped their feet in rags to keep from freezing. Still, the order was to push forward. The once mighty German army, built for speed and power, now crawled through ice and death. The Soviet defenders, driven by desperation and patriotism, counterattacked with everything they had. From factories deep in Siberia, reinforcements poured in. Women worked day and night to produce weapons, food, and uniforms. The battle for Moscow became a symbol of resistance. The Germans, exhausted and starving, were forced to retreat for the first time. The myth of Hitler's invincibility was shattered. But victory came at an unimaginable cost. Entire cities were reduced to ashes. Villages disappeared under the snow, their inhabitants gone forever. Millions, soldiers and civilians alike, lay dead on the frozen ground. The war in the East was no ordinary conflict. It was a war without mercy, without humanity. Both sides committed horrors beyond imagination. But it was here, in the endless fields of the Soviet Union, that the fate of the world would begin to turn. As 1941 ended, the world was engulfed in darkness. Europe lay under Nazi control. Asia was trembling before new wars, and across the Pacific, another storm was about to break. While the snows of the Eastern Front swallowed armies whole, another storm brewed far across the Pacific. The United States, still clinging to neutrality, watched the chaos in Europe with growing unease. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke often of defending democracy, but the American people, scarred by the memory of the First World War, wanted peace. Yet, in the shadows of Asia, a new empire was rising. Japan, under Emperor Hirohito and its militarist government, sought to dominate the Pacific. It had already invaded China, leaving destruction in its wake. Now, its eyes turned toward the rich colonies of Southeast Asia, and the one nation that stood in its way was America. The tension grew with every passing month. The U.S. froze Japanese assets, cut off oil supplies, and warned against further expansion. Japan, feeling cornered, chose a path of war. Their plan was bold, calculated, and ruthless: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one decisive strike. The date was December 7, 1941. A Sunday morning, the island of Oahu, Hawaii, lay peaceful under the rising sun. American sailors were just beginning their day at Pearl Harbor, unaware that hundreds of Japanese aircraft were approaching, fast, silent, and deadly over the ocean waves. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs fell. Explosions ripped through the air as torpedoes struck battleships anchored in the harbor. The USS Arizona erupted in flames, its decks torn apart by a massive blast that claimed over 1,000 lives in an instant. Planes burned on the runways. Ships capsized in the water. Men fought to save their comrades as black smoke filled the sky. Within 2 hours, the attack was over. More than 2,400 Americans lay dead. The Pacific Fleet was shattered. It was one of the darkest mornings in modern history. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress with words that would echo through time. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. America had been awakened. Isolation was over. Neutrality was gone. The sleeping giant had risen, and it would not rest again until victory was won. The United States declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America. In an instant, the conflict had become truly global. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, from Europe to Asia, the world was now engulfed in total war. Factories roared to life across America. Soldiers enlisted by the millions. Women filled the workforce, building tanks, planes, and ammunition. The nation's spirit burned bright with resolve and vengeance. But as the fires of war spread across oceans, one truth remained clear: this would not be a short fight. The attack on Pearl Harbor had united a nation, but it had also opened the gates to unimaginable suffering and sacrifice. The war was now everywhere, and for millions across the world, the darkest hour had just begun. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ignited the Pacific like a spark in dry grass. In the weeks that followed, the Empire of Japan surged across the ocean with unstoppable fury. America was still reeling from its wounds, but Japan wasted no time. The rising sun advanced swiftly. Nation after nation fell before its might. From Hong Kong to Malaya, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Philippines, Japan's war machine struck with precision and terror. Entire cities burned. Civilians fled into the forests. Prisoners of war were marched for miles without food or water. The world watched in horror as one empire after another crumbled before Japan's relentless assault. In the Philippines, American and Filipino soldiers made a desperate stand at Bataan and Corregidor. For months, they fought without supplies, food, or reinforcements. When they finally surrendered, more than 70,000 prisoners were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March, a brutal 100-kilometer journey through the jungle. Thousands died under the scorching sun, beaten, starved, and executed. The Pacific was no longer just a battleground, it had become a graveyard. As Japan's empire spread, the United States faced a harsh truth: the road to victory would be long and bloody. But America would not back down. In the months following Pearl Harbor, factories roared with life. Shipyards worked day and night. Young men volunteered in droves, driven by vengeance and duty. The nation's spirit, wounded but unbroken, had turned to fire. The U.S. Navy, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, began to strike back. At Midway, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal, new heroes were born. For the first time, carrier-based warfare ruled the seas. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun. In April 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Colonel James Doolittle, launched from an aircraft carrier to bomb Tokyo itself. The damage was minor, but the message was thunderous: Japan was not untouchable. For the first time, the empire that had spread fear across Asia now felt fear itself. Yet the Pacific War was unlike anything the world had seen. It was fought not only with weapons, but with endurance through jungles filled with disease, across islands soaked in blood, under skies lit by fire. Every victory came at a terrible price. Every inch of land was earned with sacrifice. Both sides fought with unyielding determination. Japanese soldiers were trained never to surrender, to die for their emperor. American soldiers were told they were fighting for freedom. For every life lost at Pearl Harbor, two nations, two ideals collided in the vast blue of the Pacific, leaving behind nothing but smoke, death, and courage. By late 1942, the tide of war was beginning to shift. The Japanese advance slowed, their power stretched thin. Across the Pacific, America was gathering strength, preparing to strike back harder than ever before. The Pacific burned, but from its flames. By the middle of 1942, the war had reached its breaking point. Across the world, battles raged on land, sea, and sky. For years, the Axis powers had advanced without mercy. Europe bowed to Hitler. Asia trembled before Japan. But in two very different places, far from each other, the tide of history was about to turn. One battle was fought in the frozen ruins of a Soviet city called Stalingrad. The other, on the open waters of the Pacific Ocean, near a small atoll called Midway. Both would change the fate of the world forever. Stalingrad, the city that would not die. In the summer of 1942, Hitler turned his eyes east once again. He sought to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and crush the Soviet spirit by taking Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. The German army swept forward with brutal force. Bombers turned the city into rubble. Yet, among the ruins, the Soviets stood their ground. Street by street, building by building, room by room, the fight continued. The Volga River ran red with blood. German soldiers described it as hell on earth. Snipers hid among shattered walls. Flamethrowers lit up basements filled with desperate defenders. The cold was merciless, the hunger worse. But the Soviets refused to retreat. As Stalin declared, not one step back. Then came winter. The Red Army launched a massive counterattack, encircling the German Sixth Army. Cut off from supplies, freezing, and starving, General Paulus's forces were trapped. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man, but by February 1943, it was over. Out of 300,000 German soldiers, fewer than 100,000 were left alive. It was Hitler's first great defeat and the turning point on the Eastern Front. While the great battles raged across the world, another war was being fought in the shadows, a war of courage, silence, and sacrifice. This was the resistance, ordinary people who refused to live under tyranny. In the occupied streets of Paris, Warsaw, Amsterdam, and Prague, brave men and women risked everything. They had no uniforms, no armies, no tanks, but they had hope. And when Nazi boots marched across Europe, the spirit of freedom did not die, it went underground. In France, the resistance printed secret newspapers, sabotaged trains, and helped downed Allied pilots escape through the mountains. In Poland, underground armies fought back with homemade weapons. In Norway, saboteurs destroyed heavy water plants to slow Hitler's nuclear ambitions. Every small act was dangerous. If caught, they faced torture or death. Yet they continued, whispering through the night, passing coded messages through radio signals, graffiti, or folded notes. They were teachers, farmers, students, mothers, priests, people who refused to bow to fear. Far beyond the battlefields, a silent war of intelligence unfolded. British agents from MI6 and the Special Operations Executive worked behind enemy lines, gathering secrets and training resistance cells. Double agents deceived the enemy, feeding false information to Nazi high command. And in the heart of the Third Reich, a quiet rebellion brewed even within Germany itself. Military officers, priests, and scholars began plotting against Hitler, a conspiracy that would later explode in the infamous July 20, 1944 assassination attempt. They failed, but their courage showed that even inside Hitler's empire, humanity still flickered. The Holocaust, humanity's deepest wound. But as resistance grew, so did the cruelty of the Nazi regime. Across Europe, millions of Jews, Roma, and political prisoners were hunted and sent to concentration camps. Behind barbed wire and guard towers, the Nazis built factories of death. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would forever stain human history. The world did not yet know the full truth, but whispers escaped through survivors and spies. The resistance smuggled photos, reports, and testimonies out of the camps. They risked everything to tell the world what was happening in the shadows. It was the darkest chapter of mankind's story, one born of hate, silence, and fear. And yet, even here, some found the strength to resist. Secret uprisings erupted in ghettos and camps, proving that even when stripped of everything, the human. By 1943, the resistance had become a symbol of hope. They weren't fighting for territory or power. They were fighting for the soul of humanity. And when the day of liberation finally came, their bravery would light the path forward. For now, they waited, listening to radio signals from London, preparing for the day when the Allies would return. In the quiet streets, painted on walls, and whispered through the night, 3 words carried their dream. By 1943, the winds of war had begun to shift. The Axis powers were no longer unstoppable. From the ruins of Stalingrad and the victory at Midway, the Allies had found their strength. Now, they turned their eyes toward the liberation of Europe itself. This was the beginning of the Allied comeback, a relentless march that would bring freedom back to a world drowning in tyranny. The fall of Mussolini. The first step came in the south. After years of fascist rule, the people of Italy had lost their faith in Mussolini. The Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, and within weeks, Mussolini's empire began to crumble. Italian soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Hitler, furious and desperate, sent German troops to occupy northern Italy. The once mighty dictator was arrested by his own people, only to be rescued later by German commandos. But his dream of a new Roman Empire was dead. Italy had fallen and Europe trembled with the sound of change, preparing for D-Day. As the Allies advanced northward, another plan was taking shape across the Channel, a plan so bold, so immense, that it would become one of the most daring operations in history. It was called Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. For months, the Allies gathered in Britain, building fleets of ships, tanks, and planes. Hundreds of thousands of men trained in secret. Fake armies were created to deceive the Germans, feeding false intelligence to the enemy through spies and double agents. The world waited for the moment of truth. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Before dawn broke over the coast of Normandy, a storm raged across the sea. Yet, despite the danger, the order was given. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Warships opened fire, and from the waves, thousands of landing craft surged toward the beaches Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Gold, and Sword. As the ramps dropped, chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the surf. Men fell, one after another, but still they advanced. Amid the smoke, explosions, and screams, courage rose above fear. By the end of the day, the beaches were secure. The Allied flag once again flew on French soil. By 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was collapsing under its own madness. The dream of world domination had turned into a nightmare of ruin and despair. Cities lay in ashes. Armies that once marched in triumph now retreated through mud and fire. The Allied advance came from the west, and the Soviets thundered in from the east. Between them, Hitler's empire was being crushed mile by mile, street by street. The last stand. The final chapter began with the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble in the winter of 1944. He threw his last reserves into the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines. For a brief moment, the Germans pushed forward, surrounding American troops in frozen chaos. But the Allies held their ground. When the fog cleared, the Nazi offensive was broken. Now, there was no turning back. As 1945 dawned, Allied bombers turned German cities into infernos. The Red Army swept through Eastern Europe, uncovering the horrors of concentration camps, silent witnesses to genocide. Each liberated camp revealed the truth of what the world had refused to believe. Millions murdered, not by battle, but by hate. Berlin burns. By April 1945, the Soviet forces had reached the outskirts of Berlin. The city that once celebrated Hitler's rise now burned under his fall. Tanks rumbled through the rubble, artillery shattered what was left of the capital, and civilians fled through the ruins. Deep beneath the city, in a concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler faced the end. His once loyal generals were gone, his armies destroyed. Refusing to surrender, he blamed everyone but himself, the Allies, his commanders, even the German people. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in, Hitler ended his life with a gunshot. The man who plunged the world into darkness was no more. Germany surrenders. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. Church bells rang across Europe, flags waved, people danced, and tears fell as 6 years of horror came to an end. It was Victory in Europe Day, a moment of triumph, but also of mourning. Tens of millions were dead, entire cities erased. The world had survived the darkest hour, but it would never be the same again. The aftermath. In the ruins of Berlin, children played among broken stones. Refugees wandered through the wreckage of nations. The Nuremberg trials began, where surviving Nazi leaders were held accountable for crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, justice tried to rise from the ashes of war. Out of the devastation, the world vowed, Never again. Never again would tyranny be allowed to grow in silence. Never again would hate march unchallenged. The war was over, but its shadow would haunt generations to come. While Europe celebrated victory, the war was not yet over. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, another storm still raged. The Empire of Japan, battered but unbroken, refused to surrender. And so, the final and most devastating chapter of the Second World War began. The Island War. The fight for the Pacific had been brutal beyond imagination. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, from Saipan to Okinawa, every island became a fortress, every beach a graveyard. American Marines and Japanese soldiers clashed in battles that turned paradise into hell. At Iwo Jima, over 20,000 Japanese defenders fought to the death rather than surrender. The image of U.S. Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became a symbol of determination, but the cost was staggering. On Okinawa, civilians were caught in the crossfire. Tens of thousands died. For the Allies, the lesson was clear. An invasion of Japan itself would bring unimaginable bloodshed. The Manhattan Project. Far away, in the deserts of New Mexico, a secret weapon had been born. For years, the world's greatest scientists had worked in silence, racing to unlock the power of the atom. They called it the Manhattan Project, and in July 1945, they succeeded. A blinding flash lit up the night sky at a place called Trinity, the first atomic explosion in human history. President Harry S. Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's death, now faced an impossible choice. Should he use this terrible weapon to end the war, or risk millions of lives in a final invasion of Japan? On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., a lone B-29 bomber named Enola Gay appeared over the city of Hiroshima. Seconds later, the world changed forever. A single bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, detonated above the city. In an instant, everything within miles vanished in blinding light and roaring fire. Tens of thousands died instantly. Tens of thousands more in the days that followed. Hiroshima became a silent wasteland of ash and twisted metal. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, fell upon Nagasaki. Once again, the sky turned to flame. Once again, a city ceased to exist. The world had seen power beyond imagination and horror beyond. Shocked and broken, Emperor Hirohito made a historic decision. For the first time, the voice of a Japanese emperor was heard on radio. He told his people that the time had come to endure the unendurable. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. The war that had engulfed the world for 6 long years was finally over. A world forever changed. But peace came at a terrible price. Over 70 million lives had been lost. Cities were gone, nations scarred, and humanity faced a new reality, the nuclear age. The world had entered a new chapter of fear and hope, power and responsibility. The war had ended, but its shadow would linger for generations. For in ending the greatest conflict in history, mankind had discovered its most destructive weapon. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world stood in ruins. Cities that once pulsed with life were now graveyards of stone and ash. Families searched among rubble for faces they would never see again. The war was over, but peace did not come easily. For 6 years, humanity had lived through hell. Now came the struggle to rebuild not just nations, but the soul of mankind. Europe in ruins. Across Europe, devastation stretched as far as the eye could see. Berlin, Warsaw, London, Tokyo all had been scarred by fire and steel. Railways lay twisted, bridges shattered, and millions wandered without homes. The victors and the defeated alike faced starvation and disease. In Germany, the Allied forces uncovered the full horror of the Holocaust, mountains of shoes, piles of bones, and the ashes of 6 million lives. The world looked upon these camps in silence, unable to comprehend the evil that had been allowed to grow unchecked. But from that silence came a vow: never again. The birth of the United Nations. Determined to prevent another global catastrophe, leaders from around the world gathered in San Francisco in 1945. From their meeting rose a new hope: the United Nations. Its mission was simple, yet profound: to preserve peace, protect human rights, and foster cooperation among nations. It was born from the ashes of war, a fragile promise that humanity could learn from its darkest mistakes. Though imperfect, it marked a new beginning, an attempt to replace bullets with dialogue, hatred with understanding. But even as peace returned, new tensions emerged. The once allied powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, began to distrust one another. The atomic bomb had changed everything. The world was now divided between two superpowers, both armed with weapons capable of ending civilization itself. The Cold War had begun, an uneasy standoff between freedom and communism, democracy and dictatorship. It was not fought with armies in the same way, but with spies, propaganda, and fear. Yet, after so much bloodshed, the people of the world longed for peace. They rebuilt their cities, reopened their schools, and planted gardens where bomb craters once yawned. Life, somehow, began again. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of Russia, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Pacific, millions lay buried beneath the soil of war. Soldiers, civilians, mothers, children, all victims of a conflict that consumed an entire generation. Their sacrifice became the foundation of a new world, one striving to be better than the one that died in flames. And though the memories fade with time, the lessons remain: that peace is fragile, freedom is precious, and hate once unleashed can destroy everything. As the sun rose over a broken world, there was grief, but also hope. Out of the ruins, nations rebuilt. From despair, compassion was born. And from the darkest hour in history, humanity took its first step toward the light. Though the fires of war were extinguished, its echoes never faded. The Second World War did not simply end, it transformed everything. Borders changed, empires fell, and the world awoke to a new reality, forever shaped by the lessons written in blood and sacrifice. This was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new age, a divided planet. Out of the ruins emerged two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Together, they had defeated fascism, but now, their alliance dissolved into rivalry. The Cold War spread like a shadow across the globe. Iron curtains fell, nuclear arsenals grew, and once again, fear became the language of politics. Yet even amid this tension, the world remembered what unchecked hatred could do. Nations sought balance. Alliances formed: NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and the uneasy peace of deterrence kept the next great war just out of reach. The scars of WWII became the caution signs of the modern world. A world transformed. The war changed every part of human life. Technology leaped forward: radar, jet engines, rocketry, and atomic science, all born from conflict. But it also inspired compassion. From the ashes of destruction rose hospitals, schools, and organizations built to protect the innocent. In Asia, Japan transformed from empire to democracy. In Europe, former enemies became partners, leading to the creation of the European Union, a symbol of peace through unity. Women, who had worked in factories and hospitals during the war, refused to return to silence. Their strength redefined societies and sparked movements for equality around the world. Even in tragedy, progress took root. Across the continents, memorials rose where battles once raged. Rows of white crosses in Normandy, silent stones in Hiroshima, empty shoes by the riverbanks of Budapest. Each monument whispered the same plea: remember, because forgetting is the first step toward repeating. Veterans returned home as heroes, but also as haunted souls. The memories of comrades lost, the sounds of gunfire and screams, they carried them for life. And so, they told their stories, hoping that future generations would understand the cost of freedom. World War II taught humanity its most painful truth: that evil thrives not in noise, but in silence. That indifference is as dangerous as hate. And that courage, even in the smallest heart, can change the fate of nations. Every child born after the war lives in the shadow of its lessons. Every peace we cherish was paid for by those who never came home. The world rebuilt not only its cities, but its conscience. And though the darkness of war can return at any time, the light of remembrance still burns. In the end, The story of World War II is not just about destruction, it's about resilience. It's about how humanity, standing on the edge of extinction, chose to rise again. But their echo became a promise to remember, to protect, and to never let history repeat itself. In a war that consumed the world, surrounded by death and destruction, one thing refused to die: the human spirit. Even in the darkest corners of history, light found a way to shine. This is the story of courage, compassion, and hope, born from the ashes of despair. The power of one. Not all heroes wore uniforms. Some carried rifles, others carried bread, medicine, or false identity papers. In Nazi-occupied Europe, ordinary people did extraordinary things. In Poland, Irena Sendler risked her life to smuggle more than 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, hiding their names in jars buried beneath a tree. In the Netherlands, Corrie ten Boom and her family sheltered the persecuted behind false walls in their home, paying a terrible price when discovered. And in France, farmers, priests, and villagers defied the Gestapo, leading refugees through the forests to safety. Each act of defiance was a spark of humanity in a world engulfed by hatred. The soldiers' humanity. Even on the battlefield, compassion survived. There were moments rare and fleeting when enemies saw each other not as monsters, but as men. In the freezing winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, 3 American soldiers and 3 German soldiers found themselves trapped by a blizzard in the same cabin. Instead of killing each other, they shared food, warmth, and peace for one night. When dawn came, they went their separate ways, back to war. For a few hours, humanity had triumphed over duty, and there were those like Desmond Doss, an American medic who refused to carry a weapon but saved 75 men during the Battle of Okinawa. He was mocked, beaten, and nearly court-martialed, but he never gave up on saving lives. For his courage, he became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. Love in the shadow of war. Amid the chaos, love endured. Letters written on scraps of paper crossed oceans. Couples married on battlefields, in bomb shelters, under burning skies, choosing love when tomorrow was never promised. In the ruins of cities, mothers held their children close, whispering lullabies over the sound of sirens. Nurses comforted the dying with trembling hands. Even prisoners in camps shared their last piece of bread with strangers. These moments, small yet powerful, proved that kindness could exist even where all hope seemed lost. The light that never fades. When the war ended, the world remembered its heroes, not just the generals and leaders, but the quiet souls who refused to surrender their humanity. They reminded us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. That love is stronger than hate, and that even in the darkest hour, goodness can survive. The war destroyed cities, but it could not destroy compassion. It took millions of lives, but it could not kill hope. Because as long as one heart beats for peace, humanity endures. The world had been on fire for 6 long years. Cities reduced to ashes, generations shattered. When the final shots of war echoed into silence, an eerie calm spread across the battlefields of the earth. The war that began with ambition ended with exhaustion. The guns fell silent, but the silence carried the weight of 70 million souls. The end of the inferno. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Hitler was gone. His empire of terror collapsed into ruins. Berlin, once the symbol of power, now lay broken, its streets filled with rubble and ghosts. Across Europe, prisoners stumbled out of camps, dazed and skeletal, stepping into sunlight they hadn't seen in years. In Asia, the war raged on until August, when the world witnessed a new horror. The skies above Hiroshima and Nagasaki burned brighter than the sun itself. In moments, entire cities vanished. Thousands of lives were erased by mankind's most terrible creation, the atomic bomb. The war had ended, but humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. The cost of peace. When the smoke cleared, the numbers were almost beyond belief. More than 70 million people, soldiers and civilians, men, women, children, were dead. Entire nations were scarred beyond recognition. Famine followed the fighting. Disease followed the famine. The victors celebrated, but even victory felt hollow. Because how can anyone truly celebrate when the world lies in ruins? How do you rebuild after such darkness? Yet, somehow, people did. Brick by brick, street by street. Hearts slowly began to heal. Children laughed again. Flags rose again. But beneath every celebration lay a single truth. The world could never go back to what it was before. Lessons in the silence. The silence after war was not peace. It was a reminder, a warning whispered by the graves of the fallen. Never again. Nations gathered in hope to form the United Nations, promising to protect future generations from the horrors they had witnessed. War criminals were tried at Nuremberg, facing justice for the crimes of genocide and cruelty, and humanity began its long journey toward reconciliation. Yet, scars remained. Families searched for loved ones who would never return. Survivors carried invisible wounds, memories too heavy for words. But in that pain, the world found purpose, to remember. The dawn after darkness. As dawn rose over a wounded planet, something new began to bloom. Hope. The same humanity that built bombs also built bridges. The same hands that once fired guns now reached out to rebuild. Artists painted, poets wrote, and voices across the world cried out for peace. For in the end, World War II was not just a story of death, it was a story of endurance. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, there will always be those who light a candle instead of cursing the dark. When the smoke of war finally cleared, the world that emerged was not the same one that had entered the flames. Borders had shifted, empires had fallen, and a new global order was taking shape. One built on the ruins of the old world. This was the dawn of a fragile peace, a world reborn from tragedy, haunted by the past, but dreaming of a better future. The broken continents. Europe lay in ashes. From the Atlantic coast to the heart of Russia, cities stood like skeletons of a once great civilization. Millions wandered refugees, widows, orphans searching for homes that no longer existed. Factories were destroyed. Farms lay barren. But amid this devastation, nations began the painful process of rebuilding. Under the Marshall Plan, America sent aid across the Atlantic, helping Europe rise from the rubble. Germany, divided between East and West, became the front line of a new kind of conflict, not of guns, but of ideology. And in Asia, Japan, once the empire of the rising sun, stood humbled. Its cities bombed, its people weary, its emperor stripped of divine power. Under American occupation, Japan began to rebuild, embracing peace, industry, and innovation. From destruction, a new identity was born, a divided world. But peace did not mean unity. The world soon found itself split in two. The Cold War began, a silent, invisible struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a war of fear, spies, and nuclear weapons, a world balanced on the edge of annihilation. The same science that had ended the war now threatened to destroy the Earth. The atomic age had arrived, and every nation held its breath, hoping history would not repeat itself. The rise of new nations. While the great powers clashed ideologically, the rest of the world began to awaken. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, colonies that had suffered under imperial rule demanded freedom. From India's independence in 1947 to revolutions across the globe, the cry for self-determination echoed louder than ever. World War II had shown that power was not eternal, that even the mightiest empires could fall. And as new nations rose, so too did a new hope, that freedom and equality could replace conquest and oppression. Rebuilding humanity. The horrors of the Holocaust and the bombings forced humanity to confront its conscience. The United Nations was founded, a promise to protect peace and human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, giving every person the right to dignity and life. From the ashes of despair, humanity built a foundation for compassion. The world was scarred, but it was wiser, haunted but hopeful. For perhaps the greatest victory of all was not in battle, but in the determination to rebuild, to forgive, and to start again. World War II did not just end an era, it began a new one. The Cold War became the silent continuation of global rivalry, fought through influence instead of armies. Nations aligned under two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The world was divided between democracy and communism, capitalism and control east and west. This tension sparked revolutions, proxy wars, and space races. From the Berlin airlift to the Cuban Missile Crisis, humanity stood time and again on the edge of destruction. And yet, each time, the memory of 1939 to 1945 reminded leaders what total war could unleash. Keeping the peace, if only by fear. The technological legacy. War accelerates invention. The radar, the jet engine, antibiotics, and computers, all born or perfected under the pressure of conflict. These creations would later power the modern age, transforming how humans lived, worked, and dreamed. But alongside progress came danger. The splitting of the atom, first used to destroy, later became the foundation of nuclear energy. The same brilliance that once fueled war now powered cities. Mankind had learned to command the elements, but not always to control its own ambition. The cultural memory. World War II also transformed art, literature, and cinema. Films, books, and music carried the memories of those who lived through it, ensuring the world would never forget. Movies like Casablanca, The Pianist, and Saving Private Ryan became more than entertainment. They were reflections of human endurance. Every generation since has grown up with the images of D-Day beaches, concentration camps, and mushroom clouds. These memories are more than history lessons. They are moral compasses. They remind us that freedom, justice, and peace are never free. They are earned and must be protected. The human connection. Perhaps the greatest change was within us. The war forced humanity to confront its capacity for both evil and heroism. It gave rise to movements for civil rights, equality, and justice. People vowed never again to allow tyranny, racism, or genocide to rise unchecked. And through that pain, the dream of unity was reborn, a dream that still drives us today. Because every soldier who fell, every mother who wept, every child who prayed beneath falling bombs, they all carried a message to the future. Remember us. Learn from us. Do not let it happen again. The world has changed. Decades have passed since the guns fell silent. The soldiers who once marched through fire now rest beneath quiet fields, their names carved in stone. The cities they fought for have been rebuilt. The flags they carried now flutter in peace. But the memory of the darkest hour in history still whispers through time, a warning, a lesson, and a promise. The cost of forgetting. Every generation faces the same test: to remember. History fades easily, but when it fades, it repeats. The faces in black and white photographs grow older, the stories grow quieter, and yet, they are the roots of our freedom. The world they left us was not perfect. War still lingers in corners of the earth. Hatred still finds a voice. But every time we choose peace over pride, compassion over cruelty, we honor those who died so we could live free. Because the war was not fought for conquest. It was fought for the soul of humanity. The torch of memory. Across the world, monuments rise, silent guardians of memory. At Auschwitz, shoes and suitcases still lie behind glass, haunting reminders of innocence lost. In Normandy, white crosses stretch to the horizon, standing watch over the fallen. In Hiroshima, a dome stands in ruins, a prayer for a future without fire. Every stone, every scar, every silent grave speaks the same truth: never again. And yet, remembrance is not just about grief. It is about gratitude. For those who stood against tyranny, for those who suffered so others might not, for those who believed in light, even when surrounded by darkness. From darkness, light. The Second World War was a tragedy beyond measure, but it also revealed something indestructible: the strength of the human heart. From the ashes of cities rose the dream of peace. From the silence of loss came the songs of unity. The nations that once clashed in battle now stand side by side, trading, teaching, traveling, and dreaming together. It is proof that even after the darkest night, the dawn will come, and that the light of humanity, though fragile, will always find a way to shine. The eternal promise. So let us remember not as victims, not as victors, but as witnesses. Let us tell their stories, keep their names alive, and pass on the lesson written in their sacrifice. Because history is not distant, it lives in every choice we make, and when we choose peace, we ensure that their struggle was not in vain. The darkest hour in history was not the end. It was the beginning of our understanding, compassion, or shared humanity. And as long as we remember, the light will never fade.